Hi, my name is Asia Adams. I am the student intern for the Department of African American Studies here at SJSU, and I just want to welcome you all to our first Fall 2019 lecture series, so thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Now, before I introduce our guest speaker for the night, I'd like to pay a little attention to our crowdfunding campaign that we've been putting on for a couple of weeks now. So the AFAM department is trying to set up our first student scholarship fund. It would award students an amount each semester where they can pay for textbooks, school supplies, etc. This applies to AFAM majors. And our goal is $7,500. We're getting there because our campaign is actually ending tomorrow at 10 a.m. We'd really like to, possibly get some more donations. So if you're interested in donating to this wonderful campaign, we do have donation sheets available. If you're interested, just raise your hand, and our student volunteers will come, give you a paper, pen, and assist you in that way. Again, we appreciate it very much. This would be the first scholarship that the AFAM department would have here at SJSU, and it's really beneficial because we're trying to thrive here. There's a lot of students doing research, a lot of students who want to go to conferences, even purchase just basic textbooks would be a great step into a better department. Before I introduce our guest speaker for the night, again, I just want to give a big thank you to everyone here, whether it's for a class or you're interested in the lecture, which you should be if you come. But this guest speaker is a wonderful individual. She's a new addition to our department and the SJSU community in general. I admire her as a mentor, and I'm really excited for this lecture. So, without further ado, Akilah R. Carter-Francique, who obtained her Ph.D. at University of Georgia, is an associate professor at San Jose State University in the Department of African American Studies. She also serves as the executive director for the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change at SJSU as well. Her scholarly endeavors and field focus encompasses the intersection of sport, society, and social justice that is inclusive of issues of diversity, social movements, and the dynamics of social change and development. She employs a critical interpretivist standpoint utilizing Black feminist thought and critical race theory to illuminate issues of experiential marginalizations, and as a former collegiate athlete in track and field at the University of Houston, this includes the experiences of Black athletes in sports at all levels of participation. Dr. Carter-Francique serves as the 2018-2019 president of the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport, and she is also the co-editor of Athletic Experience at Historically Black Colleges and Universities, Past, Present, and the Persistence and Critical Race Theory, Black Athletic Experience in the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique.
Thank you for that warm welcome. Yes, I'm Akilah Carter-Francique, just moved here from Texas. So I'm getting to know the weather a little bit. I'm like, okay, we need a jacket. We don't need a jacket. Well, maybe we need a jacket. So, but it's a pleasure being here. I've been here for the past few weeks and really getting to understand the climate, but at the same time absorbing all I can SJSU, hence my blue and yellow, so thank you. But I want to thank, first and foremost, Dr. Berry. I know she's not here today. She's traveling herself to give a speaking engagement as well. African American Studies, MLK Library, for this opportunity to speak. And you all, students and community that could be here today to hear what I have to say, because it's a Thursday afternoon. I know the week is winding down, so this is oftentimes a stretch. But I wanted to come and share a little bit of my work with you. Hopefully it will be something that you find interesting, students. I know be ready to take copious notes, but just a little bit of my work as it pertains to African American women, Black women in the sport world. But before we get into that, I thought I'd share a little bit more of who I am as a person. Maybe, is this gonna click? Yeah, let's go back one. So this is me. Who am I? Oftentimes, I know we go to presentations, the person gets up there and speak, says their long spiel and you really don't have any backstory. But I really like to take an opportunity to sort of share who I am. I was born and raised in Topeka, Kansas. And spent majority of my childhood there, to parents of K-12 educators. So being in Topeka, Kansas during that particular time period, I'm a little older, just had a birthday, but was around in sort of the wake of Brown v. Board. And sort of the next generation and that wave of young people that would experience that integration that took place. While there, again, inundated with the education mindset, but then I also embarked into sport, and that would forever change my life and the things that I do. I started running track and field at the age of 5. So I was a little bitty girl. And a lot of that start was due to the fact that I was asthmatic. It was a health concern. And so my parents were informed the best way to help me learn about fitness and exercise and controlled breathing and whatnot was to get involved in a sporting activity and endeavor. So I have an older brother who ran track and field. So we would always go to track meets and I was always running around, not on the track, but running around. So my parents were like, well, let's just put her in something and see how she does. And I tried. I won. They were like, okay, this is going to work. And so I basically stuck with it. I tried some other sports, from volleyball to martial arts, but those sports really shaped my life. And to be honest, I really loved it because I got to travel. I got to go to different states. Eventually I would go to different countries. And so I like this. So I really kind of stuck with it. But more than anything, I got to meet a lot of different people. I learned different things about, again, culture, education, diversity, character development. And so sport brought a lot to me in that. So these are just a few pictures of people that have really had a strong influence on my life. Some colleagues up there. My kids, Aiden and Alex, representing their father's country of Grenada. Our family, we went to the Martin Luther King Civil Rights Museum in Tennessee, where were we? Tennessee, yes. My parents, of course, other sister docs who I say, other African-American women that also received their PhD that have supported me throughout their journey as well. And so I want to give a shout out to each and every one of them, as well as great influences and mentors today that we even have in the audience, to include Dr. Harry Edwards, so thank you. So getting into this presentation, I'm often influenced by great writers, great scholar activists, and one such individual is Audre Lorde. And so I begin this presentation talking about we're thriving with this quote. For as long as any difference between us means one of us must be inferior, then the recognition of any difference must be fraught with guilt. To allow women of color to step out of stereotypes is too guilt-provoking. Think about that quote. It's going to carry us through this presentation today. For students, purpose of the presentation, I know we have some of our instructors in the audience today, but I really want to talk to you about intersectionality theory and looking through this lens of intersectionality and how we can identify the influence and the role of stereotypes on Black sportswomen underrepresentation as sport professionals. If you're looking at this image here, you're going to see some additional meaning about how they see themselves versus how others may see them. Arrogant, over-sexualized, aggressive, mannish, versus notions of being confident, feminine, powerful, and lean. I come to this subject too because it's not just a sport issue. If we've been following television, if we've been looking at politics, we know that the role of stereotypes is played in our society. If we look at our national topics, we've got what's been deemed the squad that has a role and influence in how they are characterized based on their racial, ethnic, national origin. We have other influences that have been highly in the media. Those of you that have seen me speak before know that I talk about the role of the Real Housewives, Love and Hip Hop, Basketball Wives, And we think about those images and those personas that are displayed for all to see. Even in the positivity, in some respects, of Kerry Washington playing in Scandal, there's some connotation there about what it means to be a strong black woman, but yet you're the mistress as well. How those roles of being an angry black woman may play in our politics and our criminal system, and we think about the death of Sandra Bland. But all of these have been promoted and stimulated for a long time. If you go back, young people, to the movie Gone with the Wind, some of y'all might have to look that up, Scarlett O'Hara. But look up Hattie McDaniel and the role that she played. One of the things I sort of point out with this particular movie is that her role was as the mammy. But when you look up what her actual name was in the movie, it says Mammy. So it was not enough to even give her a name, but just that particular role. So I want all that to sort of stick with you as you think about the role of stereotypes. In the world of sport, this is one of our most recent images. I just want you to look at this. Serena Williams, powerful, phenomenal. Many deemed her as the GOAT. But yet and still, she is the subject of such characterization. So I want to ask the audience, when you think of black women, what comes to mind? I do this exercise with a group I have called Sister to Sister. When you think of black women, what comes to mind? And be honest, we're in a safe space. It's okay. You can yell out some words, some characterizations. Strong. Okay. What else? Can't hear? Beautiful. All right. Resilient. Others, let's be truthful. Loud. Those loud black girls. What else? Uneducated. Angry. Sassy. Okay. All those things come to mind. Black. It's often a negative connotation. Black women, we're bitter, we're loud, we're aggressive, we're angry, we're the Jezebel. But we also experience a lot of things in that inner working and that intersectionality, which I'll go into. But I want you, again, to keep those images. You had a lot of positive words, which was beautiful to hear. Unfortunately, that's not the day-to-day reality, unless you're in some certain circles and safe spaces. So I deem and bring to you this notion of intersectionality. Some of you have been introduced to it already, so I understand that. Others of you may have not been, so I want to take a time to kind of go through that real quick. What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a term coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. It comes out of critical race theory, but she says it has this idea that we all have the same life. It's false. Race, class, and gender come together to share life chances of people in very different ways. To learn more about this, because we don't have the time to really unpack the nuances of it, I want to encourage you all to seek out, you got smartphones. She's got a TED Talk entitled The Urgency of Intersectionality that was in October of 2016. Take the time to listen to that. But one of the things that she brings to our attention is this notion of the intersection. That when you live at the intersection, and you have these different competing identities, you don't always receive the benefit of one of them. They all intersect. So your race, your sex, your social class, whether you're able-bodied, your national origin, they all collide at this intersection. But oftentimes in legal matters and in certain situations, we become categorized only in one. So we're seen and categorized, and we're just going to focus on this is a black issue. Or we're just going to focus on this is a female issue. or this is a LGBT plus issue. And so we have to think about what happens when those intersections collide, because we all live at the intersections, really, right? We all live at the intersections. And so when we talk about intersectionality, it's a framework for understanding the ways that multiple aspects of our identities intersect, influence one another, and compound to create unique experiences. We all are a part of a certain social class. We identify racially and ethnically different. We have different identities when it comes to our sex and our gender orientation, right? But we have to really keep that in mind and how that can play a role in our daily lives. And so I bring to you this notion of intersectionality because this is the lens I want to use as we go in and unpack some of the challenges, the experiences and challenges that Black female athletes face at the intersection. When she talks about this notion of intersectionality, it's really broken down into these three different areas of structural, political, and representational. So from a structural perspective, and I'll take the time to read this, again, as an educator, you gotta stay on script a little bit, okay? So from a structural perspective, women of color are differentially situated in the economic, social, and political worlds. When reform efforts undertaken on behalf of women neglect this fact, women of color are less likely to have their needs met than women who are racially privileged, okay? So that's structural. Political looks at a different vantage. What are those political structures? When we talk about political intersectionality, this notion highlights the fact that women of color are situated within at least two subordinated groups that frequently pursue conflicting political agendas. So just as I talked about before, if they meet at the intersection and the issue erupts, maybe a hiring situation, for example, do we classify this as a racial hire? Or do we classify this as a gendered hire? But how does that work if you're at the intersection? What boxes will we check? From a representational perspective, it says representational intersectionality would include both the way in which these images are produced through a confluence of prevalent narratives of race and gender, as well as a recognition of how contemporary critiques of racist and sexist representation marginalize women of color. So here we're having this conversation of the projection of images. And the quick way to sort of think about it is media. How does the media play a role? What images do they produce for we as women? And what role does this play in the development of Black sportswomen more particular? So I talk about this and how, again, this role of media images, because when we think about what jobs and career options that Black sportswomen may have, well, what careers do we see them in? What are they pursuing? What degrees? What are they studying in school? I talk about this notion because when I look at coaches such as Don Staley, dynamic player, coach, national champion, Olympian, an Olympic coach. She's done great things. Carla Williams, who I actually got the opportunity to meet and hang out with a little bit of my time at University of Georgia. Her pathway to becoming an athletic director. What was that experience? Again, former athlete, right? We have to think about all those things. And Katrina Adams, president of USTA, what was her quest? What was her journey to becoming that president? One of the things I say is that oftentimes this pathway is uncharted. So when I look at myself, when I look at my colleagues, when I have young people ask me, how do I get a career in this? How do I obtain a position in athletics? I'm often left a little speechless because there is no pathway. These women are often left to forge their pathway on their own. I have a great colleague that stated that when we look at, for example, Carla Williams' rise to be an athletic director, he says that she had a 20-year interview. Think about that. Because we see some of those white males, their pathway to becoming an AD may take about 5 years. So what challenges, what hurdles, what did she have to prove in order to get to that space? What does it mean to be othered? What does it mean to be double burdened? What does it mean to live at the intersection? This notion really came to mind, and what really struck a nerve for me and became interesting for me was last year, the Players Tribune produced Where Are All the Black Coaches? And it featured Coach Don Staley. Coach Don Staley, and let me read my notes here so that I can, again, stay on track. Don Staley, head women's basketball coach at the University of South Carolina, penned a letter in the latter part of November 2018. The letter questioned, where are all the black coaches? In my opinion, this letter serves less as a question seeking answers and more as a testimony describing the state of and journeyed experiences of black female coaches in the NCAA. She stated that black women in coaching positions are held to higher standards, especially because there are so few opportunities. There are stereotypes we have to navigate, like being the angry black woman. She stated that. When we talk about that, her observation is key because more often than not, black sportswomen, athletes, coaches, administrators, staff, and even faculty, right? Stereotype characterizations precede their entry into participation and career opportunities. So before they even walk through the door, there's a preconceived notion of who they are and how they'll be. When we look at some of the data on black women coaches, work produced by Dr. Richard Lapchick at the University of Central Florida, the Tide Institute, he puts out this racial and gender report card every year. And it's stated on the 2017 report, for example, college sport received a C+ for race in hiring practices and a C for gender hiring practices, again, affording them an overall C grade. Lapchick went on to say in an article that based on that, women and people of color need to be hired. So, you know, I did my little math. We put 1 and 2 together. That's black women, right? So what are the things that are challenging them? What are the things that are in the middle of their way? What are the hurdles that they're experiencing? And it comes down to this notion of discrimination. Again, another note, students, right? And this notion of discrimination, what that experience is access discrimination and treatment discrimination. Definitions are on the board, right? But ultimately understanding that when we talk about access discrimination, it's how do I get in the door? What's stopping me from even getting an interview and being selected to even have the opportunity to interview, right? And for those that forge away and are able to get that interview, get in the door, and then work, how am I being treated? Hence treatment discrimination. Meaning, do I have the opportunities to work towards promotion? Again, I think of this 20-year interview with Carla Williams. Was she afforded opportunities for development of skills that would get her to the next level? Was she afforded the opportunity to go to conferences, to be mentored, to receive trainings? It's something to think about and something that we have to consider. So I examined that report card, right, to identify the implications of the grades for black sportswomen as athletes and professionals. Lapchick and his colleagues stated that the racial and gender grade for college athletes was A and B. So they were doing well on the recruitment and retention of people of color and women, but those hiring practices were not there, right? Thus, while black sportswomen as athletes' overall representational statistics are low when compared to white men, black men, and white women, researchers and other scholars conclude that they are adequately represented, but still overrepresented in basketball and what other sport? Come on now. What did I just say I did? Track and field, right? Okay. So however, black sportswomen professional representation as coaches, athletic directors, senior women administrators do not meet the same standard of representation. For example, the report said, and specifically at the Division I level, there were 11.4% black women head coaches compared to 43.4% of black women basketball players. Stark difference. He also suggested coaching percentages was a gross underrepresentation of Black women coaches in comparison to the number of Black women athletes. Also, when we look at senior women administrators at the D1 level, D2 and D3, they reflect levels of 13.8%, 7.9%, and 4.4% representation at these three different levels of colleges. But when compared to white women, at the D1 level, 81.9%. At the D2 level, 84.8%. And at the D3 level, 92.4% representation. Let that sink in. Where are they? Additional professional positions such as athletic directors, associate athletic directors, assistant athletic directors reflect similar underrepresentation and statistical patterns for Black women. So, if we stem from these historical legacy of Black sport women professionals, those that have proved successful carry with them a level of excellence, right? And a look or stereotype image that is appealing to college sport and the corresponding leadership. So those that have been able to get through the door, they look a certain way. They speak a certain way. Perhaps their demeanor is more palatable to not make people uncomfortable. Their hair, we gonna go there. Their hair is more relaxed to make other people relaxed. So we have to keep that in mind. Thus, it's important to employ these theoretical underpinnings of intersectionality to identify the influence of stereotypes on Black sportswomen's underrepresentation as college sport professionals and as sport professionals in general. So what plays a role in all of that? When we talk about this notion of underrepresentation, when we further this notion of intersectionality, we get into this heart of this notion of myths and stereotypes and how they begin to play a role in their experiences. When we talk about myths, what are they? These are traditional stories. One's concerned of early history of a people or explaining some natural or social phenomena, and typically involving some supernatural being or event when we talk about a myth. It's a widely held but false. Let me say that again. A widely held but false belief or idea. That's a myth. How does this pertain to Black women? This is when I need some audience participation. Almost an amen corner, if you will. So we have this notion, the myth of inferiority. The myth of inferiority. Does anybody in the audience kind of understand this notion of where inferiority would come into play? Someone said it earlier. How might Black women be deemed as inferior? Say it again. Uneducated, not as smart, okay? So we know that one. This myth of unshakability. Where would that come into play? Black women having to be strong all the time. Yes. To the point that we often embody that, right? I'm a strong Black woman. We see those t-shirts, I'm a strong Black woman, right? The myth of non-femininity. Where does that come into play? Say it. Female athlete. Wow. The very group we're talking about right now. Because having muscles means something, right? Being lean, being fit means something. Playing sports like basketball has a meaning and significance. Being involved in track and field has a meaning and significance, all right? The myth of criminality, where could that come into play? Yes, school suspensions definitely coming into play. And we'll get into a little more of that as we talk. The myth of promiscuity. Over-sexualized, hyper-sexualized. What does that mean? Again, we go back to our reality TV. How are we portrayed? How are we represented in the media? What does that mean? Stereotypes also come into play. Bertinsky and Captain state that when we talk about this characterization and this notion of stereotypes, add words such as woman to black, and the result has been a set of racist and sexualized discourse that have clothed, defined, and determined the African American woman while delimiting the modes and spaces of action available to her and coloring her athletic achievements with fantasy and stereotype. It is with this sentiment, coupled with media headlines and the result and findings of research investigations, that I personally believe that there's a need to examine the role of these myths and stereotypes as it relates to that access, right? So when we talk about those stereotypes, what are they? They're exaggerated belief associated with a category. Its function is to justify, rationalize, even our conduct in relation to that category. So how do we work with you based on what box we think you're supposed to fit in, right? So let me take it a little deeper. And this is a little history lesson. Black women stereotypes. I want you to take a moment to sort of just look at this picture and think of, which I talked about before, the mammy, and the era in which that characterization was developed, and each one that comes from that. So there are four main stereotypes of black women, to include the mammy, the matriarch, the Jezebel, and the welfare queen, right? The four stereotypes, or what we call as controlling images, are rooted in black women's sexuality and were created to preserve and justify white supremacist capitalistic power structures. The mammy image is described as a faithful domestic servant created to justify the exploitation and economic disenfranchisement of maids and domestics. That's our first characterization. The matriarch is often likened to the sapphire. So for those of you that are old enough and remember Amos and Andy, okay? Young people, look it up. It's described as the bad black mother created to contrast the mammy image and otherwise blame the state of black youth, their educational status, their poverty levels, their immoral behavior on black single women. Identified as a main provider for family income, her demeanor is viewed as angry, it's viewed as mean, and it's also viewed as emasculating her male counterpart. Then you have the Jezebel. She's described as, probably an old school word for some, a hoochie. Y'all may use other terms today, perhaps thought, right? Sexual siren, created to represent black women's sexuality, presume promiscuity, and justify sexual assaults of black women by white men. There's a great documentary out about Recy Taylor and the rape of Recy Taylor. Again, if you're not familiar with it, look it up. But it also falls into line with the Me Too movement and how things are justified based on your levels, right? The last is the welfare queen. She's described as poverty-stricken, materialistic government aid recipient, created to justify the destruction of moral values and the economic drain in America due to her poor work ethic and lack of male partner. The description of these four images is significant as their presentation exhibits how racist, sexist, and classist ideologies could operate simultaneously for the derogation of black women, and how intersectionality can become institutionalized and affect the perceptual identities at the structural, political, and representational levels. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I have the mammy, the Jezebel, the matriarch, the welfare mother. They're at different times, post-slavery era, 1865 to 1896, the Jezebel during the Jim Crow era, 1896 to 1954, the matriarch, 1954 to 1980, and then that welfare mother, post-civil rights era, okay, and the Reagan era. But at the center of this, I have the Hottentot Venus. Anybody know who she is? Anybody heard of her before? Sarah Bartman. Who was Sarah Bartman? I know he knows, Doc, yeah.
She was an African woman of Namibia, which is Southwest Africa.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the French brought up and made a spectacle of her body.
Yes.
And then eventually she died, and they even cut up parts of her body and put it on display.
Exactly. And the way she was built and the way her body was put on display helped perpetuate what we have here today. That mammy, the Jezebel, the matriarch, and the welfare mother. So it stemmed from something very real, and then that myth took over. Stereotypes came out of that. Okay. So we know it's true with all these stereotypes, but it doesn't necessarily stop there. Someone mentioned sassy earlier. Yes, sassy. But we have to understand that sassiness is also harmful to how we begin to believe of who we are and who we can be. Interesting enough, those 4 characterizations don't stop there. Oh no, we're getting into it. We're getting into more. Stevens and Phillips bring forth these sexual scripts. Again, those 4 initial images are steeped in sexualization and how they're sexualized. Stevens and Phillips talk about these notions of controlling images as sexual scripts. So I'm kind of dating myself with my imagery. I'm a little older, y'all, okay? So I have here the diva with Miss Who? Beyonce, B, the Beehive, okay? Don't come after me. Black Twitter, please. I have the gold digger. Again, for those of you who are from a different time, who do we have here? Robin Givens, and she's reemerged on some other shows now, so that's good to see. The freak. Nicki Minaj, I updated it. I did have Little Kim, some of y'all again. The dyke, right? Who's my image? Queen, from what movie? Set It Off, all right. The gangster bitch. EVE, who has changed her persona, right? She's on daytime talk shows. She's restructured, right? Sister Savior. Yeah, she's trying to fix everybody. Not everybody can be fixed. We are learning, yes. But Inyala, right? Earth Mother. Who do we? Jill Scott, that's my, love me some Jill Scott. And then baby mamas. Yes. But these are some of the images. What do you guys think about these? Had you thought about this before? Have you seen these images in the media? Do you see individuals that may embody and may want to embrace some of these characterizations? Yes? No? Yes? Okay. But we see that, and we see reiterations of it. So from our young people, we probably have new people that would sort of fit some of these categories today that are on display. From our diva to our gold digger to our freak. Who would fall in our freak category today? From an image standpoint. I'm learning about these people. Meg Thee Stallion, okay. Do we have some other ones that would have more present day images? City Girls, okay. Cardi B. Trina, all right. So we have those images today, right? And we can see some of that, and some of our entertainers embodying that, sort of characterizing that. So it becomes difficult to sort of shake those scripts, to shake those stereotypes, when you also have young people believing that that's who I should be, because that's who I see on TV. That's my representation, right? How does that manifest in the workplace? We have new iterations in the workplace, right? These iterations, they reflect race, gender, and social class notions as well as sexuality. Those 8 iterations described as sexual scripts are reflective of evolving economic, political, and social changes. But thus, in the wake of civil rights movement and the Black Power movement and the evolution of media and technology, again, those sexual scripts were born. Eventually, their manifestation would influence Black women's adolescent embodiment. So you were talking about earlier, if we were to go back real quick, you were talking about earlier the notion of criminality of our young Black girls. And while this is an aside to this notion of sport and sport participation, it does play a role, because some of these same young women participate in sport, but they're oftentimes getting expelled from school, right? Because some of our schools, and my daughter was in one last year, you have to wear a school uniform. She's very tall. She had to wear a big size. But you can imagine if these young women have already developed and matured in different ways, and the way these uniforms are cut, they're going to be deemed differently. And so they're often expelled because of not being in compliance with uniforms. So those are things that we have to think about when we talk about the embodiment of these sexual scripts and how they may play a role in our perception of our young people even, right? Stereotypes in the workplace. Reynolds and Dobbs talked about this evolution of controlling images from historical images to that of the crazy black bitch and the superwoman. That crazy, right, is unstable, angry, vindictive, aggressive, defensive, and untrusting to others in the workplace. We might have seen some of that, right? While you have the superwoman is an overachiever. She's intelligent, she's articulate, she's professional, she's assertive, she works all the time. She's very hardworking. She doesn't have a personal life, right? We got some laughs, right? Hello, how you doing today? Strong black woman, right? Superwoman. But I would add that these images and even the sexual scripts are perpetuated and permeate throughout society, creating barriers that hinder the professional growth and even the career development of black women throughout the collective. So it's not just for our sportswomen, right? It's for black women throughout the collective. And I would even add women of color and even women, right? We have to deal with a lot of different stereotypes about who you are and what you should be and how you should act in certain spaces and places in order to get to the next level. What does that mean in the sport realm? Well, in the sport realm, we have this. A number of negative stereotypes that have been perpetuated. When black sportswomen matriculate as athletes and or as professionals through college sport, they endure a range of treatments based on their intersectionality. As you'll look at these images here, you can see some of the challenges that our young women have had to face, right? Or that we've seen displayed on television. They're shaped by societal perceptions as well as institutional culture, causing black sportswomen to walk through doors of, for example, our historically white institutions, even our HBCUs, to be prejudged and maligned by their image. Examining issues of higher education and other social organizations through this critical lens centers race and racism and offers an opportunity to articulate how race, how gender, and social class operate and intersect and affect these respective groups. When we look at literature in higher education, right, and sport, it reveals that the influence of racial stereotypes permeate virtually every facet of a black woman's sojourn. From college athlete to professional coach or administrator, living at the intersections, and I want you to get this, living at the intersection as a black sportswoman in college sport, for example, requires an ability to move through space of race, sex, and class oppression, inadequate or biased counseling at the pre-collegiate and collegiate levels, and a lack of minority women as a role model and as mentors. So as I even think about and reflect on my experience many, many moons ago, and think of those role models that I had, there were none. I had one female coach. She came in later. She was white female, still amazing, but no one that looked like me. So who were my role models? Who were my mentors? Can we guess? My mom. I call home frequently, right? But who else would I take advice from? My peers. Now let's think about that, young people. What does that mean when you're getting advice from your friend whose lived experience may be totally different? And again, we're thinking getting advice from another 18-year-old. I'm sorry, I was gonna keep it real. Sometimes we don't make the best decisions at 18, and sometimes we don't know all. And so that becomes a real challenge as you're going through school, trying to achieve academically, achieve athletically, and at the same time come into your own, because your identity is shaped and formed when you get to college. You have the opportunity to come to wonderful lectures like these, right? Be educated by wonderful scholars, participate in other group activities, but you could never, and you may never, engage with anybody that looks like you. How can that affect one that's trying to grow and develop and know what it means to come into their own? There are definite challenges that take place. There's definite effects that take place when we talk about these experiences. Some of you are older than others in this room, and so I think we can take a moment to kind of even reflect on what do we think the effects of myths, stereotypes, and discrimination can have. Our young people too. What do we think those effects could be, right? We start embodying these notions of, oh, I guess I am angry. I guess I am crazy. I guess I'm not good enough. You start suffering some imposter syndrome, right? I shouldn't be here. Maybe I shouldn't apply for that job. Maybe I'm not good enough. Even though I've done this, this, and this, and I've got all these degrees. But they said, and they hired, and they look like, and I don't. You get those feelings. It's gotta go. When we talk about those stereotypes, they often operate on multiple levels. And so we see that, again, in those access discrimination pieces, from a microaggression, macroaggression, and that good old boy network. And just real quick to kind of go into some of the institutional challenges when we're dealing with microaggressions first and foremost, it's this notion of felt racial microaggressions. And felt is a very key word in this commentary, because it's not an issue of, this is what I think happened. No, it's what you think as that individual. This is what happened. This is how it made me feel. This is how I internalized this slight. Not being invited to lunch, not being invited to after work cocktails. They're little slights. Not being invited to some colleague's birthday party for their kid, right? Little slights. Or invited to meetings, right? Little powwows, just hanging out in one another's office. Those felt microaggressions. That notion of intellectual inferiority comes up again, right? I'm less than. Or, as I've often seen, because I've worked at different types of institutions, working with some African American students that went to HBCUs, that then transferred to the graduate program in a PWI, and were deemed as less than because they went to an HBCU. Or were deemed as less than because we come from a different country of origin, or we are of a certain socioeconomic status. So that notion of intellectual inferiority because the school I chose to go to, right? Then that juxtaposition, we gotta play that role, being in the world of sport, of masculine versus feminine behaviors. What is appropriate? So, what we see ourselves as aggressive, or they see ourselves as aggressive, we see ourselves as what? Assertive. This is how I want things done. This is what I'm asking, and you can even do it in a nice, calm, soft voice. She is angry. I don't know why she is yelling at me. My son does that sometimes. But it is that notion, because of what you look like, that you are characterized as coming off very aggressively. You have the macroaggressions, and again, that goes back into those hiring practices. Who are the people that are seated at the table, right? And on those hiring teams, what do the hiring team look like? How do we begin to deal with those individuals that are sitting at the table and hiring certain people when they're considering people? What names come up? And then wage equality. Megan Rapinoe brought it up again, right? 80 cents to the dollar. And I even looked at some of the details when we talk about NCAA coaches. Women, on average, women coaches make $2 million less than a male coach. I don't know how you feel about $2 million. I think it's a lot. There's a stark difference and a stark reality. And all of that goes back to this notion of, again, the intersection of patriarchy, right? The sexist scheme where we have this good old boy network that is a structural system that begins to seep into our other levels of organizational practices and how we do what we do on a daily basis. It's exhausting. It's extremely exhausting. The span of myths and stereotypes is far-reaching for Black sportswomen. And so again, I use that quote of Audre Lorde at the beginning. I want you to remember what that was, right? It demonstrates the constant excellence must be demonstrated to achieve professional positions in the sport world. So while there are no identified pathway for black sportswomen like white males or their black male counterparts, black sportswomen, again, must chart their own course. We go about it different ways. Every black woman I've talked to has a different pathway. And it's very interesting. I'm like, well, when did you go to school? Well, I went at this time, right? Well, where did you get your work experience? Well, I worked in campus rec, and then I worked in a youth sport club, and then I worked in college athletics. Okay, well, what did you do? Well, I interned at this company. Everyone has a different journey, a different path. And so to go on even with notions from Audre Lorde, she said, those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic, and I say nor a sport, skill. We learn on our own. We learn from our peers. We find a way. We try to make a way out of no way. There is value in positive imagery. So I want you to take a moment to look at some of these. Althea Gibson, tennis and golf champion, just receiving a statue. Just receiving a statue. Okay. Brittany Griner, WNBA basketball player. The Black Women in Sports Foundation, Tina Sloan Green, she's doing great work there. C. Vivian Stringer and what she's been able to achieve, right? Gabrielle Douglas, Brielle White, swimmer. We've got athletic directors, Ingrid Wicker-McCree. Ariana Smith, protesting, social justice initiative, right? Dawn Staley and all that she's done. Venus and Serena, and who I always pay homage to is the Tennessee Tiger Bells, Wilma Rudolph, and her significant presence. These positive images make a difference, not only for their ability to embark into these journeys of sport participation, rise to the accolades of being an administrator, but even taking a stand. The strength, again, sport is something that builds strength. It builds development, but it also builds a lot of cultural competence and an understanding that there's some social justice issues that we must address. And you have a platform as an athlete. Ariana Smith, again, first ever activist of Black Lives Matter. The women of the Minnesota Lynx. Caster Semenya, and what she's dealing with as far as the sex testing. And a documentary soon to come out on Venus's Verse, right, by Ava DuVernay. Her quest of talking about equal pay for women at Wimbledon and those social justice efforts. But again, we come back to, we started with the GOAT. We're going to end with the GOAT. Serena Williams. And I call it personal as political. I think of the journey of Serena and what she and her sister have endured coming out of Compton, California. The rise that they've had, the struggles that they've faced, but this notion, the characterization as an angry Black woman, the body politics, because what? Her uniform. And she's still pushing the envelope on that. Her on and off the court racism and sexism by officials and even the media that she has to deal with. Health issues, one of the most recent things that she's embarked on, having her daughter. And she's raising awareness, right? Raising awareness about some of the health issues and challenges that women of color face being in those medical spaces where doctors don't believe that you're actually having these actual feelings, right? That you're experiencing these pains, that it's all in your head, it's some sort of psychosis. But she pushed for it and they found the clot, thank God. Otherwise, what? She could have experienced death. And when we look at the rates of maternal death for women of color, it's extremely high. Right? Sexism, maternity leave, right? Being able to have a baby as a professional athlete and still have your contract when you get back. Those are some real issues that are facing. So all those things, when we talk about those stereotypes, the role they play, being able to support one another, play a role in shaping who these young women are beyond the court, field, pool. Okay. And another thing that I want to point out that I think is extremely important and often I think gets overshadowed is the importance of nurturing young Black women. The importance of nurturing young people in general, right? Whether they're in K-12, or at the college level, whether they're at the professional level, Black sportswomen need to receive some programming and services that aid in their development, right? Why? Because oftentimes within respective institutional spaces, Black women have not only negotiated their identities, but cultivated their identities with no guidance and, again, limited role models. More directly, living at the intersection as a Black sportswoman, they have coped with systematic subjugation and disenfranchisement with no identifiable safe spaces. No identifiable safe spaces in these particular institutions. Identifying the nature of benefit for presenting success strategies may appear simple. We're going to talk about that in a second, based on the effects of myths and stereotypes. But again, Black sportswomen must have limited representation and do not have access to the social networks that support their career development. While this is true, another significant reason is the psychological duress that Black sportswomen endure as a consequence of their marginalized race, sex, and social class. So what do I mean by that? Jones Shorter Gooden talk about this, even in this notion of myths, but they state that stereotypes based on race, gender, and social class make it hard to trust oneself. Let me say that again. Stereotypes based on race, gender, and social class make it hard to trust oneself and to trust others who look or behave like you do. They set confusing parameters on who you think you are and what you believe you should or can become. They often dictate what you expect, what seems real, and what seems possible. So when we look at these institutions and other sport organizations, we really have to speak to the leadership, speak to those in charge, and help them be apprised of different ways that these negative racial stereotypes, the campus cultural climate, I know we have some people in here that work on that, right? And organizational culture can affect Black professional women's mental health and identify strategies to allow them to have a healthy way to achieve some success, okay? And so I have up here Imani McGee Stafford. I went to a conference a few years ago, the Black Student Athlete Summit at the University of Texas in Austin. And she was very open and forthcoming talking about her mental health challenges as an athlete, okay? A very famous mother, basketball player, Pam McGee, and she's got a brother that plays in the NBA as well, but you would think all those things would be right with her, right? Great home, great stature, but yet she still is experiencing challenges, right? I too, along with other teammates, have suffered those challenges, again, because nobody looked like me. So whether it be again, that imposter syndrome, just feeling down, a lot of self-doubt, having instructors tell you that you're less than because you're a student athlete. They speak loud. They speak loud to your development, and they translate even over and can translate over into your athletic performance and just the way you live your life day to day. So we have to be really mindful about that even for our athletes, but even when we get into these spaces and places where you're the only one that looks like you that is working in a sport organization. Okay? Mental health, something that we have to be mindful of. So now it comes the work from you all, because this is a community conversation. So I want to understand from each and every one of you, what intersectional strategies can I use to support Black sport women to achieve success? If I see one, if I see a sister, right? I see a young woman that's aspiring for great things, what can I do? From a structural standpoint, oftentimes we're not in these different vantages, but from a structural standpoint, you may be in a position of power. Okay? You may be in a position of authority where you can actually incite some change and create some change. One of the things that I talk about here is this notion to promote cultural competence and promote culturally responsive practices within those spaces and places. From a cultural competence standpoint, it's a cultural or conceptual framework that's described as a person's possession of cultural knowledge and culturally relevant skills to aid in the holistic development of persons. The framework functions under the guise of three factors. You've got to have cultural awareness and beliefs. cultural knowledge and cultural skills. Incorporating culturally competent staff and leaders in college sport requires a willingness to learn. Thus, cultural awareness and beliefs requires a person to be sensitive, sensitive to their personal values, biases, and other conceptions that may influence their interactions by Black sportswomen, athletes, and professionals. The knowledge requires that a person learn about a Black woman's culture. So we're not getting questioned about your hair. What does it feel like? How long did it take to do? Why do you change it every 2 weeks? Okay, some of y'all know what I'm saying. What does it feel like? Let me touch it. Yeah. So we go through those things. How does that make one feel? You invaded my space. I need you to back up. We need arm's length, right? Cultural knowledge, again, requires a person to learn about those experiences, their perceptions of what it means to be other than the sport world and society. Cultural skills require a person to employ culturally sensitive and relevant method to interact with Black sportswomen. The incorporation of these three factors is necessary in all of these environments to support that notion of diversity, okay? From a political standpoint, and this is again centered on collegiate athletics, oftentimes, and what they use is sort of the Eddie Robinson rule. So if we're hiring individuals, we've got to have a person of color, all right, in that pool. If we're hiring something for women, we've got to have a woman in the pool. Judy Sweet rule. So those are things to begin to think of how can we revamp and look at our policies when we talk about hiring and bringing in a candidate to ensure that we're providing opportunities for access into those spaces and places. And that begins to go into the policies and procedures and processes that we go by in creating those avenues for success. And lastly, representational. And if you're like me, when I started out, I was just one lone person. I was not in a position of power. I didn't have any way to create policy or enact any sort of social change from that political standpoint or platform. So I operated from this representational specific space by always promoting and putting out positive pictures of my young women, by supporting them and uplifting, going to their events. I even created a program called Sister to Sister, where I met with women at Texas A&M and had them come together. We met once a month, talked about just issues. How are you doing? But we talked about real issues. How do you see yourself? So going back to the activity I asked before, when let's say Black woman, what do you think? It was very interesting during those interactions. I said Black woman and they were angry, bitch, ugly. They didn't have any positive words in their own image. And that's hard when you start out. So we met once a month, talked about different issues, from what words we choose to communicate with one another. Because if it's okay for you to call your friend a bitch, right, then guess who else it's okay for? Other people. So we had to start changing the dialogue and the words we use with one another. Hey, beautiful. Right? Hey, sis. We talked about that. We talked about body image. We talked about earlier masculine or muscles, athletic body is often deemed ugly. They drew images of themselves in ways that they did not want to look like that. Again, harsh realities to deal with. And here I am coming in, and I'm a professor, so I'm not even on the athletic side of things. I came in from the outside to speak to these young people and help them know, you're going to be okay. I've lived your life. There's a pathway, and you don't have to do this alone. And we created a community of sisterhood. This program was with my colleague, Dr. Denise Dortch, who's doing some great things now as well across the country. You can also create platforms, and I have a colleague, Monique A.J. Smith, that has what's called a chat in the garden. And so she is on social media like crazy. And one of the things she does, she highlights and champions women that are doing good things in athletics. She posts a new athletic director or a young sister getting an internship. She posted myself. I was like, oh, thank you. I appreciate that. But doing those great things in the sport world. So you have to have those spaces and places and platforms. And it's even something that you all as young people who are readily available to that social media, engage with it, to begin to see those positive images of yourself, to celebrate one another, and to know it's okay to champion one another. We don't have to tear each other down as we see oftentimes on television, right? We don't have to tear each other down to feel good about ourselves. And then that opportunity to give those young women an opportunity to be unapologetic. Don't apologize for being you. Be unapologetic, be bold, be authentic, and work together to cultivate a network. That's one thing I will say about my time being at University of Houston with those older girls on the team, because they actually took care of me. They raised me. They are my older sisters. I was very fortunate. They kept me out of trouble. They're like, no, you come with me. We went to the party together. We left together. My older sister rang those keys. If you were not with the keys, you get left. So we knew we got to be in the car, let's go, or she's going to be, upset. So we had somebody that stood in front of us and allowed them to be our sister's keeper. We created that sense of community. So I encourage each and every one of you, depending on where you're at and what station you're at, right, to create some sort of platform to support and uplift these young people so they can strive and achieve their dreams as well. Again, I talk about the importance of positive images. We started out with a lot of negativity, but these are the images I want to convey. The images of these women, the political powerhouses, the images of mothers of slain Black youth, and how they've come together as a community to survive. Of course, we got Oprah, right? Hattie McDaniel, Maya Angelou, our Olympians. 2016 was the most powerful year when we talk about the representation of Black female athletes, getting gold, getting medals, being on that podium and stand. And it was beautiful to see that celebrated, not only in the US, but also in our other countries. And of course, my daughter, Wakanda forever, she is Shuri. She is so excited to be here in this tech space. She is creating things and making things that I'm like, what is that? She just got a drone. I'm like, okay, I've got to figure out how to put that together now. But these spaces and places, Black Girls Rock, I don't know how many of you guys saw our mother, our Queen Mother of Wakanda, Angela Bassett, giving that very powerful speech. That's what we want to do, uplift one another, empower one another, and really embody that. I'll end it with this, and then we'll open it up for a few questions, because I know I've talked a lot. We've got to really embrace this notion of Black girl and women magic. We've got to really celebrate the positivity to help each other get to the next level. But illuminating how myths and stereotypes have rendered Black sportswomen invisible and underrepresented in professional positions is vital. We can't dismiss it. And will challenge the conscious and unconscious biases of dominant leaders in sport in our society. Employing this intersectionality theory, the structural, political, and representational level, issues, challenges, and strategies were provided also to challenge and raise consciousness on Black sportswomen and really apprise administration and leadership that sometimes are unaware of what their work is actually doing in those particular organizations in multiple ways that Black sportswomen can and should be supported. While intersectionality is an institutional practice, it has the ability to interrogate power dynamics and promote diversity and inclusion efforts to limit systemic marginalization across varying intersecting identities. Institutions like higher ed, and even our sport organizations, K-12, youth sport, professional sport, need to consider and adopt these organizational change practices and policies that will ultimately benefit their respective sport programs, upholding diversity initiatives, and for those Black sportswomen, they can see and they can feel that they are of value. Thank you.